let's bring in senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy and author of When China Attacks, Colonel Grant Newsham. Colonel, good morning to you. Thank you for hopping on with us. So China has responded to this already. They've condemned this attack, says it damages Washington's credibility and are concerned that the situation may spiral out of control. So that's what they're saying publicly. But behind closed doors, what conversations are really taking place when it comes to decision making in key areas of interest, including aggression, potential aggression towards Taiwan?
Well, what they're looking at is this big change that's happened in the United States. Suddenly you have a president who has some backbone and did what needed to be done for the first time in 45 years when he attacked Iran. The Iranians have been at war with us for 45 years, 46 actually. They've killed some thousands of Americans, injured and maimed a lot more, and nobody ever did anything other than to send them pallets of cash and try to negotiate a deal. And here you had someone that attacked them. So China was looking at Taiwan also and thinking maybe the Americans aren't that serious. And this has raised some doubts in China's calculus when it comes to Taiwan, when they look at what's just happened in Iran. But of course, we have to see how this plays out, because China has been very happy to have the Americans occupied in the Middle East. That means you can't pay as much attention to the Western Pacific, to Taiwan.
That's a great point on how this could go one way or the other. And before this strike, Colonel, there were reports of Chinese cargo flights nearing Iranian airspace. What do you think that was all about?
Well, it could be. There's always things that we don't know about that happened. They were certainly flying things into Russia at the start of the Ukraine war, and the administration hushed it all up. So that is a possibility. But the bigger issue is that China has been the main backer of Iran for decades. And that includes providing a lot of money, a lot of weapons that the Iranians have given to Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis as well. And now China actually buys 90% of Iran's oil. So that's about 20% of Iran's GDP. And that's the real issue here, is the amount of support that China has given to Iran and used Iran really as a cat's paw, as a proxy to attack America's friends in the region, to cause chaos. And that, to the Chinese perspective, that works to their advantage. Now we have to wonder, are we going to cut off Iran's oil exports and force the Chinese to go buy oil elsewhere?
Well, that's a great question, Colonel, because yesterday Iran's parliament did approve a plan to close the Strait of Hormuz, which would block $1 billion of oil shipments per day. This is Iranian retaliation, but like you said, this would impact China far more than it would the United States. So here's Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday. Watch this.
Do you expect Iran to move to close the Strait of Hormuz to try to disrupt oil transportation across the world?
Well, I encourage the Chinese government in Beijing to call them about that, because they heavily depend on the Straits of Hormuz for their oil. If they do that, it'll be another terrible mistake. It's economic suicide for them if they do it. And we retain options to deal with that.
So does China do that? Do they call Iran and say, do not close the Strait of Hormuz?
They might, or they might say just let Chinese ships through, like they've done in the Red Sea with the Houthis. So that is a possibility. But closing off the Straits of Hormuz is actually harder than you might think. It's been tried before, back in the 80s, and the Iranians couldn't pull it off. But that would require more of a commitment by U.S. forces. And we don't seem to have too many allies who are willing to jump in, but maybe we could shame a few into that. So it's easier said than done, but it is a concern. Whether or not China will actually help us or do us any favors, I doubt that. We should give them a choice, really. Do you want to do business with Iran, or do you want to do business with us? You do that, and China just might act a little differently.
Yeah, so yesterday, Vice President J.D. Vance said that China, Russia, and the United States have one thing in common, and it's that neither of these nations want Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. Is that true? And if so, do you think President Trump will ever get a private thank you from Russia or China?
I'm not so sure about that, and I'm not so sure the Russians or the Chinese really mind all that much if the Iranians have nuclear weapons. Look, they've allowed the Pakistanis to have them, the North Koreans to have them. Those have all been developed with Chinese assistance. And the Russians have played a role in this as well in both of those cases. So I don't know that we have that commonality of interest as the administration might think.
Colonel Grant Newsham, thank you very much for joining us this morning. A Fox Business alert, Iran's parliament voting in favor of closing a major shipping route, putting as much as 1/5 of the world's oil supply at risk. It could cost suppliers big time, as Forbes finds that roughly $1 billion worth of oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz daily.
Cheryl Casone from our sister network Fox Business here with the details. Cheryl.
Good morning. Yeah, when oil prices actually started trading last night, we did see an initial bump. We've seen that kind of come back a little bit now, because the question is, if they decide to eventually close the Strait of Hormuz, and it is not for sure yet because the Iranian Security Council has to be the ultimate decider on that, that means that 20% of the world's oil is going to be, well, shut off. This is a problem, though, guys, for China, because 3.3 million barrels a day go to China through the Strait of Hormuz from Iran. And if you listen to Secretary Rubio, who was on with Maria yesterday on Fox News, he says that's not a good plan for Iran. Watch.
Do you expect Iran to move to close the Strait of Hormuz to try to disrupt oil transportation across the world?
Well, I encourage the Chinese government in Beijing to call them about that, because they heavily depend on the Straits of Hormuz for their oil. If they do that, it'll be another terrible mistake. It's economic suicide for them if they do it, and we retain options to deal with that.
Yeah, so here's a real quick number from Forbes. More than half of the energy that flows through the strait, again, goes to China. So if you look at a map here, just to kind of give you guys a sense of what we're talking about here and why the Strait of Hormuz is so crucial to global supply of oil. It connects the Gulf of Oman with the Persian Gulf. But, you know, look, at the end of the day, the pressure could be on China to deal with Iran. What were those planes doing going into China? I mean, excuse me, into Iran, those Chinese planes. You know, there's a lot of questions here, guys. Yeah, that's
right. We were talking to Colonel Grant Newsham, who's become an expert on China, and he says that China could make that call to Iran, but what they could say is, you can close the strait, but just allow our ships to go through. So that could also be another real possibility there.
There's also another possibility here that's unfortunate. I heard you talk about this in the last hour on the program, is that you could see some smaller level attacks. It could be IRGC, small boat attacks against vessels, not Iranian vessels that are exporting oil over to China, but other world ships, global ships that are going to other destinations. And that's another problem. There are other ways that Iran could try to find a way to push back against the United States.
But I do think it is clear that China's economy relies on cheap Iranian gas, under market value gas. Something like this could hurt them. So to that point, will China end up sort of pushing for a resolution if Iran decides to close off the Strait of Hormuz? It certainly is fascinating to watch. I know Cheryl's going to be talking a lot more about this over the next 3 hours on Mornings with Maria.
We are.
Cheryl, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Guys.
All right, let's bring in co-host of the Big Money Show, Taylor Riggs. Taylor, good morning to you.
Good morning.
If Iran does close this strait, how does it impact Americans here at home at the pump?
You know, I'm not sure it does immediately, because we are much more independent from Iran and all of the global oil supply than we were, let's talk about back in the 1990s, which we could go into when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and then we had to get involved, and then that was a whole other issue with oil. So the good news is we've totally diversified since then. The other good news is Trump went to Saudi Arabia in the Middle East just last month, right? And shored up all of our support there. So to follow up on what Cheryl said, Saudi Arabia, if they close the Strait of Hormuz, Saudi Arabia has channels through the Red Sea where they could still export oil. And again, it's only 20%. So there are other levels, I think, that the Middle East could pull. And Trump has done a very good job of trying to isolate Iran. So let's quickly talk about Iraq invades Kuwait in 1990. Oil prices spike, the S&P 500, the equity markets fall. So if you're waking up this morning and you're like, I'm going to just sell my whole equity portfolio, I'm totally freaked out, I think this is World War III. You plunge 20% 2 months later, and then you rally 24% even before the U.S. gets involved the following January. By the following April, you've regained all of that money and then more. So I think it's important for Americans to wake up and say this is very different in 30, 40 years. Right. And there's, we're more diversified and we're a much more resilient economy. So that is the good news.
I'm glad you mentioned wake up, because we have a lot of people who wake up literally at 5:45.
Yeah. Good morning.
Good morning to you. Who turn this show on, and probably this morning, they turn it on for business at around this time.
Yeah.
This morning, they're probably wondering a dollar amount, a penny amount, a cent amount that their gas is going to go up at the pump.
Yep.
If I'm hearing you, you don't think it's going to go up that much.
No.
So I had a question for you. How much is it going to go up and how soon? You're saying
I've heard,
no and not never.
Yeah, I've heard 3 to 6 cents a gallon in the short term. Again, all of this matters, just like with the tariff conversation, duration and intensity. So as long as this isn't a drawn out thing, look at oil. If oil goes to 80, that's the signal that this is the market pricing in longer and more intense than we thought. That's price per barrel, not gas at the pump. If it goes above 80, then that translates into maybe 3 to 6 cents higher at the pump. A couple months from now. We're also in peak driving season, peak travel season. So oil prices were going to go up anyways because we're all out on the road driving to the beach or whatnot. So a caution, but the good news is we're a much more diversified economy than we were, let's say, in the 1990s when this really did impact us.
And on that front, some more numbers here. The U.S. imports 0.7 million barrels per day of crude oil from Persian Gulf countries through the Strait of Hormuz, which accounts for 3% of our consumption. 70 to 82% of all of the oil from the Strait of Hormuz is destined for Asian markets. So the largest recipient is absolutely China, which is why Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that yesterday.
I would be cautioned about getting nervous about Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's biggest source of revenue to fund these wars is selling oil to China. They can't bite the hand that feeds them. We're not really buying it. China is. So they also were in a tight spot where they need the revenue. China needs the oil. They're dependent on each other. We're not the major player involved in that relationship the way we were 30 years ago.
Yeah, the only concern is I totally understand what you're saying, but the oil markets are still somewhat interconnected. I'm going to go worst case scenario, and then I promise I'll stop going to negative town here.
Let's do it.
What if we need to increase our capacity? We can't just build a refinery in a week. Do we have the capacity to bump up from our current levels, or are we already maxed out?
So the good news is break evens, which is Chevron, Exxon, they can make money when oil's at $50 a barrel. If oil's at $80 a barrel, all these American U.S. companies are like, great, this is profitable for me to drill because I can make money at 50 and it's trading at 80. Yes, that takes time. And yes, we have depleted the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Biden depleted that, which is why you don't deplete it, because in times like this, you need that. So we need to work on refilling that. I think Trump's trying to work on doing that so that we have that reserve to draw from in times of crisis.
Low oil prices mean new drilling has stopped. So an increase in prices can be conducive to the American oil industry. So another element of this. Taylor, thank you so much.
Great analysis. Appreciate it.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.